I think we don't really need to do introductions again since we've done them and we all know who each other is. One of the things I would just like to say at the beginning is, we have this legislation that is going to allow us to, more quickly, build shelters. But I would like to, put in the caveat that House Bill 2006 is only good until July of 2022. And so we really need to be looking at the future and sort of be setting the table for the future for when House Bill 2006 is no more. So that's why I think we're still in this period of, let's get this ready. Let's get it so that we can continue this process and make sure that we can house our homeless. And thank you for being here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Stacy, I'm gonna get you into the meeting here and then we can start. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. Let me go ahead and share the agenda. And I know we've got some folks in the lobby here. Oops, share my screen. We're going to have public comment towards the end today. So hopefully that works for everybody. Let's see, let me just share this. Okay, let me go back up here. All right. Okay, so today, let's see, we've got, it's kind of a compacted agenda, but I think it's going to take a while to get through everything we're hoping to get through today. So let's see, we'll just go through the minutes. Maybe I could get a motion to approve them after we go through this agenda overview. And then we're going to be talking about the different shelter types. So we took back comments from the last meeting and revised the definitions a little bit. So we'll be walking through those and asking for your approval or edits on those different definitions. And then we'll go into the different zoning districts in the city. And Pauline and Elizabeth are going to help me with this portion. And we'll be talking about each type of shelter and potential size and requirements and standards by zoning district. And that should take the bulk of the meeting because I think it's going to be a little bit I think we'll have a lot to talk about. And then, it's kind of hard to do this type of stuff virtually. So it might take a little while. And then we'll have public comment and wrap up action items. And at our next meeting in 2 weeks, hopefully we can get out a really rough draft of the code sections, the code amendments for your review. And then we can go into June and do some public outreach and then come back on those. So they'll be just pretty rough at this point, but I think it would be a good point to get the community input and everything. So sound good? Everyone? Let's see, let me go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, can you see everybody now again? Or am I still sharing? I'm still sharing?
Yes.
Okay. It's gonna be one of those days. Okay. Stop share. Okay. Hi, Brianna. Okay, let me just make sure there's no one else in the committee in the waiting room. No, doesn't look like it. Okay. So if I could, maybe we could go through the minutes. That would be great. Does anyone have any additions, comments, concerns? Again, these are brief and we have transcripts of the meetings for more detailed conversation. So maybe I could get someone, if there's no changes or anything, get a motion to approve the minutes.
Yes, I will. Yeah, Hans just raised his hand. I will recommend approving the minutes from last week.
Looks like Hans second or Eric second. I don't know who's second. Eric Tobiasen second.
Second, thank you.
Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So let me go ahead and reshare again because I think it'll be helpful to have the definitions up and everything while we go through this. Okay. Okay, so just an overview on where we are right now. We're kind of combining a few of our meetings together. We're at meeting 3. I think we're making some really good progress where we're looking at, we've developed kind of recommendations based off of what other communities have done with providing different types of shelter for the houseless. And we've got sort of some broad categories and buckets right now for shelter types. And so now we're going to be beginning to make drafts and for you to look at. And then, as I mentioned in June, we'll be doing some outreach, come back to you. We'll probably do an update to the Planning Commission and City Council, just maybe even in a memo on how we're going. And actually, we'll be having at some point in June, the Community Building Subcommittee. So that's a council subcommittee. I think Councilor Campbell, you're on it. And then Councilor Schinkelberg and let's say Councilor Keebler is on it. Yeah, I believe the other 3 are on the stewardship subcommittee. So that's a small subcommittee of council members, and there's public input at those meetings. They'll be advertised and everything, and you can dig into the code language a little bit more before it goes to the full council. And then if needed, we'll come back in July and we'll do some more input in July and then go to Planning Commission in August. So that's the plan for now. Let's see. So I'm going to go up to here to the different types of shelter. So we took your recommendations from the last meeting, and I can't see folks. So if you have comments or input, go ahead and just unmute and feel free to interrupt, or maybe Pauline or Elizabeth, you could watch the chat bar and see if anyone's raising their hand and let me know. So broadly, we revised a little bit our past definition and went to just a broad definition for shelter. And so what we're determining as shelter is a location for overnight accommodation of people who lack permanent housing. A shelter site may be permanent or temporary and is either an outdoor shelter, mass shelter, or transitional shelter. So we revised this definition just to make it clear that a shelter is for people who lack permanent housing at the moment, and it can be a permanent or a temporary site. So we thought this addressed your input from last time, talking about whether somebody can stay there longer term than just a temporary stay. So does that kind of capture what we talked about last time? You can go ahead and unmute and just feel free to speak.
I think I was the one that asked for the ability to be a more long-term, and I'm fine with this.
Okay.
I just had a question about how we would handle, because we talked about kind of like temporary mass shelters. So if there are events that that might cause a temporary surge in houselessness, and how the code would address that. I think one of the things people talked about was temporary mass shelters in high school gymnasiums or something like that, and how that gets handled between the one that's more of like a mass shelter versus more of a permanent mass shelter as a entity, not as people staying there.
Yeah, good question. So more like a severe event shelter.
Yeah, or if that
like
is
for
that just
fire
something that's
or-
usually handled through an emergency declaration, city council kind of thing, and we don't have to worry about it here.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what we're thinking. So, and I think we're going to do an additional, Well, actually, Elizabeth, I can't see you, but would you?
Yeah,
or
I'm
Colleen?
here.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, so Scott, that's a great question. So there's sort of two sections of the code we might be considering when you think of permanent and temporary uses. So a permanent use would have a certain set of standards and would be a shelter that could be located at a site permanently. And then we have a temporary use provision section of the code, which would allow things like farm stands or other uses that only operate temporarily. And so that both words, permanent and temporary, refer to the use itself and not the duration of any one person's stay at the site. And so the concept would be we could have standards in the code for a permanent shelter site, and we could have standards in the code for in the temporary use section for a temporary site. And they could be different standards, right? Whereas if you have a temporary mass shelter, you may have a lower bar for opening it in the temporary use code, and you can put restrictions. Is that 180 days in a calendar year or something like that? We also, by doing these codes, don't necessarily lose the ability to allow even greater uses through the use of an emergency order. So this would just be trying to reduce the number of times that we use an emergency order by making permanent provisions in the code for different types of uses. That would still be an option if we didn't quite get there, or there was some really big disaster where we needed to do something else.
Thanks.
Does that sound okay? Yeah. Yeah, we kind of wanted to keep it a little bit separate from this process. So yeah. Okay. So we're envisioning, again, just 3 types of shelters. So there's the mass shelter, which is the warming shelter concept, or shepherd's house. So the definition is a building that contains one or more open sleeping areas or is divided only by non-permanent partitions, furnished with cots, floor mats, or bunks for temporary overnight accommodation. Anyone have any comments on that? Feel like it captures? Yeah, Kathy.
So under the transitional shelter, when I was talking before about our micro unit type of shelter, which had been known as single room occupancy hotel type situation, would that be under the transitional? Because we talked about, I think your shelter definition captured what I was looking for, but just not sure where this fits in, because it's not really a mass shelter. They're individual single rooms. So how are we capturing that, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I think it's in the transitional shelter definition, even though it doesn't specifically call that out. I think it's important to keep these somewhat vague, so we're not
Okay.
boxing ourselves in. So
It's just that it wouldn't
Yeah.
preclude somebody for staying a lengthy period of time, I guess is the experience in some of the locations I've researched is people stay there and, for a few years until they either pass away or they find something better. So we don't want to just limit the amount of time. And if it's vague enough that it captures that, I'm okay with it. I'm just asking if that is the case.
yeah, what I'm wondering, Pauline, maybe if you could speak to this, but what if we took out temporary or transitional before overnight in the transitional shelter definition? So it would just be a building providing overnight accommodations in sleeping rooms for people who are houseless or lack permanent housing. I don't know if that would fix it. Because I guess essentially if the people are there longer than a couple of years, then they don't lack permanent housing anymore because that's their home.
Right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yay.
So I think, like Susanna was saying, the less details, the better. A micro unit type living facility would fall under a temporary shelter. And we're not going to define what temporary or transitional means. So in the code, I don't see us putting in, well, that means you can only stay 60 days because we're not going to be regulating that. So I think the micro unit under what you're considering, Kathy, would fall under a transitional shelter. And like Susanna is saying, at some point it does become a true micro unit development if they're living there for several years.
I guess part of my concern is when we go out for public comment that there's clarity, enough clarity that people don't feel we're trying to pull one over on them, you know, or something, because I just want to make it global enough that it gets what we need, but at the same time, it's clear enough that people are comfortable with this during the public output portion. So I guess it's a fine line to walk, but so Pauline, are you saying that a micro unit development that would be developed specifically to house the houseless would be under transitional shelter even if they were staying for a lengthy period of time, or would that be something different? I guess I'm not clear on what you're saying.
Well, and I guess I need to understand, like, because these are going to have very different regulations. Like a micro unit has a different parking regulation than what I foresee a transitional shelter. Micro units are allowed in different zones than maybe what the transitional shelter is going to be allowed in. So maybe as we dive into the details of what a transitional shelter requires, then we can talk about whether or not that captures it being a micro unit at that time. Maybe we want to see what the standards are first for a transitional shelter. And if we need to add some clarity, then that would be maybe the time we look into that. Because a micro unit definitely has different zones it can be in. Excuse me, remember, it can't be in the standard residential zone unless it's part of a neighborhood commercial mixed use kind of building. So it limits where it could go. Whereas a transitional shelter, depending on the conversation here, might be able to go in different places. So then if they want to build a permanent building as a transitional shelter and it looks and acts like a micro unit, it would still be a transitional shelter following under the transitional shelter development standards, which are going to be different.
Yeah, okay, so there really could be two different types of micro unit development then.
And micro units, the one that we just adopted as permanent or, you know, rental housing. And then the shelter would be for people who are looking for temporary or transitional overnight. We're not regulating how many nights are going to be there unless this group comes up with that, but I doubt we will. And then it really is geared more towards people who are houseless or who lack permanent housing.
Okay, so that sounds good. I appreciate the clarification on that. Thank you.
And we'll keep an eye on it, Kathy, as we get through draft or, you know, get into the real drafting of the code to make sure it's still doable.
Could I comment on
Pauline,
timing?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I want to respond to Kathy's comment. I do think whether we include timing or not, and I understand that if we did, there'd be an entire enforcement issue we'd have to discuss. But just for the assumption that we're not going to put time limits on anything, I do think we need to be prepared to explain why there are no time limits. I think there are those that are going to say, well, shouldn't it be 30 days or 60 days or 6 months? And we just should be able to explain for whatever reasons, legal reasons, whatever reasons it may be, we need to be prepared to explain to the public in general why there's no time limits. My other question for Pauline would be, when we were discussing micro units previously, we did talk to the idea of we didn't want, or there was some discussion about not wanting anything that was very, very short term. We even talked about no short-term rentals. So I don't know where that falls in this conversation, but I expect the conversation about no short-term rentals for micro units is at some point going to conflict a little bit with some short-term transitionals. So I think we need to at least put that on our radar.
Okay. Pauline, I was wondering, oh, Eric, I see your hand is raised. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, yeah, I think in the prior meeting minutes, we described a few different types of shelters, and micro units was separated and didn't fall into any of these three new definitions, but it seemed like it was leaning more towards the outdoor shelter designed based on, other explanations that I found in maybe that was in the Portland data also, but it seems like, micro unit can be long-term use and transitional, right? And so I think trying to define micro unit in one set of terms is the cart before the horse. It's just a solution set to various kinds of problems. Affordable housing problem, you might use micro units for affordable housing, where they can be rented long-term, and you might use micro unit developments for transitional shelter.
Yeah.
Eric, I was concerned about any conflict that we had with code that we're writing for micro units. That's kind of where I was going. I hear you. I think a micro unit, it gets a label, and we think of it as, oh, a micro unit is something to help with affordable housing. So I think we need to be able to explain that there may be two different types of micro units, because we've got a code that we're working on for micro units, and now we're including them in outdoor shelters. So I'm just trying to be proactive about any conflict so that we don't put ourselves into a corner.
So if I could, I think we're talking about maybe 3 different kinds of micro units. So I just want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page. So we have a micro unit code that was just adopted that is, I would describe more as an apartment building full of very small studio apartments with various internal requirements. We have an outdoor shelter site, which could be multiple kind of tiny home or RV type buildings. And we have a transitional shelter, which may be more like a motel, like the Bethlehem Inn, or like a residential home that has multiple sleeping rooms in it for use as a shelter. So we have 3 different categories, and I think we're talking micro unit a little bit interchangeably for those 3 different uses. And I think the single room occupancy that Kathy was talking about maybe sometimes looks like a micro unit, an apartment building full of tiny studio apartments, and maybe sometimes looks like a transitional shelter, more like the Bethlehem Inn, where not necessarily every unit has a bathroom or a kitchen. So just wanted to try and tease those apart a little bit.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think maybe we keep saying micro unit, and I feel like we should kind of avoid saying micro unit, because micro unit is a specific type of development. It looks more like a hotel room that has specific kind of specific code things with it that provide housing. I mean, we got into the weeds with it in terms of dedicating an outlet because we knew someone would probably bring a fridge in, or a countertop kind of stove type of deal. There's requirements of public spaces and shared kitchens, and a lot of these were tailored towards making sure that this was a place that was more of like a permanent residence for those studios. So when we talk about micro units, I think I kind of feel like that's, and I think this transitional shelter, we should kind of away from using that, because I think there's just too much attachment that goes along with calling these things micro units, and I don't want unintended consequences to transition in these discussions. And as far as I wanted to, the thing is, I don't think, as long as we make it clear the city is not imposing any time limits on these, whatever entities are running these shelters, if they have their own or something, then that's up to them. But as far as time limits for staying there, if the city just says it's not up to us, I think that's a pretty easy explanation.
Yeah, and I guess I would second that, in so much as time limit seems to be more like a standard when we talked about restrooms and showers and laundry being a standard, not a code, or a zoning item. I think time limits, to the extent that it gets specified, falls under the standards category. But back to this micro unit thing, and I promise I won't use it. As my translation from, especially reading Portland and then our initial experience with Veterans Villages, a lot of these things that appear to be, micro units are really SRO, right? Single room occupancy. And there can be, a standard for that, but we're not necessarily identifying that so far. And there's the secondary component that SRO doesn't have to be in, we keep referring to transitional shelter like Bethlehem Inn or Shepherd's House and these single structures, but it can be distributed SRO also, right? So like what we're doing at Veterans Village, I consider distributed SRO, where you have individual sleeping units with or without restrooms, depending on the standard, and then a common facility for showers, laundry, kitchen, that kind of stuff. And that was, that process was absent in the current, trying to understand the current code. And I think if you look at a lot of the solutions in our peer cities, it's a lot of distributed SRO stuff.
So that concept, the Veterans Village concept, Eric, we were trying to capture in the outdoor shelter definition.
Well, exactly. And that's why I've said initially, it seemed like we've used micro unit in a couple places, but in some versions of our explanations, it's falling under outdoor shelter.
Okay, yeah. I'm wondering if under the transitional shelter definition, Pauline, if we could add a second sentence that says, something like a transitional shelter may become permanent as, over time. I don't know, something like that acknowledges that it could become permanent, and it doesn't mean that it becomes non-conforming and the resident, the owner has to go through another process. I don't know, something like that.
So one suggestion is, whenever there's a change of use, the building code comes into play. So if it is approved as a transitional shelter, I don't know if there's other building code requirements that would kick in if it became a true apartment building or a true micro unit development. I think the best thing to do, honestly, is probably start with these definitions, and then we'll start moving into what the standards look like for each of these, so that you start getting a good picture of what are we going to require for a mass shelter, what are we going to require for a transitional shelter and an outdoor shelter. And those standards will help really define what we want for a transitional shelter. And we're not going to call anything a micro unit in the transitional shelter because we already have micro units. But what we will define as a transitional shelter could look and act like a micro unit, but it's not one, it's a transitional shelter. So we'll have the definitions, then we'll have specific standards for them to fall under. And then if we need to, then we can come back and fine tune the definitions at that point. But I would suggest maybe we start looking at the next slide or so where we have, and looking at the time, some of the standards to start getting a better feel of what each of these shelters would require as we start diving into the code.
Okay, that sounds good. Anyone have any input?
I have one quick.
Barb?
Oops, sorry. Go ahead, Dana.
Sorry, Barb. I just have a question about day shelters, and if that's something that is even part of this consideration, just specifically about like some of these mass shelters or transitional shelters won't be open all the time. And I just especially think about safe places when we come into heat, cold, and season, let alone just existence, having people have places for hygiene, providers, lockers, whatever, mail, whatever comes into a day center, if that's even something that's part of this consideration, or if I'm totally out of the wheelhouse. But I just, think about all the places, and that not all shelters are always available all the time. So that's just something that I was thinking about after our last meeting. And if I'm totally in the wrong wheelhouse, I apologize, but just wondering if day shelters are part of our consideration.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and
yeah,
I think that that comes into the next slide that we're going to get to, which is what is allowed or not allowed, what may be present, what must be present in any site. And I think day use is one of those suggestions for what may be present but is not required of every shelter. So I think that's a standard, and that's a great question and a good segue into the next discussion topics.
okay, go ahead, Barb.
Yeah, Susanna, could you put that screen back up?
Yeah.
Please? Thank you so much. So we have a shelter, thank you. So a shelter is a location. So when we look at the three types, when we have a building, or a lot or parcel. So that is good for me. What I wonder about is the last part of each of them. So the first one says it's for temporary overnight accommodation. The next one says it's for people who are houseless or lack permanent housing. And then the last one says it's for use as transitional shelter. It seems to me like they're all for the same thing, and maybe we want to tighten up so that they all have, because they're all for temporary overnight accommodation, if I'm not mistaken, and they're all
Yeah.
for houseless or lack permanent housing. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. So maybe we should
Can I
check
jump
that
in?
out.
The shelter definition captures exactly what you're saying, Barb. So we can take out the specifics out of the mass, transitional, and outdoor, because they all fall under that shelter definition, which captures the lack of permanent housing and that they're temporary or permanent. So we can clean up the three definitions so they're not so repetitive and yet a little bit different in words.
Exactly. That
Yeah.
little bit different is
Yeah.
what I'm afraid people will get stuck on, Pauline. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, let me just make that
Maybe
note
just
real
a
quick.
quick input.
Yeah.
We use the word temporary and transitional sometimes interchangeably, and I think they definitely have different meanings in the space. So maybe we need to come up with a set of standard definitions, a glossary or whatever, so we can make sure we're talking the same language. Temporary overnight. So we have temporary or transitional. So transitional means maybe not temporary because it's going on for maybe up to 2 years, for an example. That doesn't sound temporary. It's certainly not permanent, right? And then there is some transition. So maybe I propose we just have a glossary with some common definitions so we can stay on the same page. Like we got into trouble with the micro unit thing because it's kind of a generic term, but there's also codified language around what it is in the city.
Mhm. Yeah,
I
we can
think
look at
that's a great suggestion, and I think we need to clarify for the public the difference between the site being temporary versus the site being permanent, but have people in there for a temporary amount of time. Because I think there's some real confusion out in the public of what we mean when we say temporary.
If I can just add one comment in regards to the day shelter, I think we should kind of put that on another conversation because that to me gets confusing, where we could consider that more of a navigation center, which will take that shelter word away for a day center, I think. And that's going to have a whole different set of guidelines.
And to continue that thought process, I think the definition of a navigation center, we should probably try to understand because it's something that we see a lot these days in House bills and whatnot, but I'm not exactly clear what it is. And some other people I'm in the services provision side of things have also mentioned some confusion.
Okay.
But maybe that gets more into the homeless services aspect. And I think this is completely designed around, building code and zoning and those kinds of things. Sorry, development code and zoning.
Yeah, Pauline, do we have a definition yet for a navigation center? We
No.
should probably do that as part of these amendments. Yeah, because with the funding and the House bill that's authorizing us to have one, it'll be coming soon. Okay. All right, let me go to the next slide. I also wanted to address the short-term rental comment that came up too. I think Hans did. We can put something in the standards to that effect. So these are what we were thinking would be provided with all shelters, all 3 shelter types. Restrooms, on-site management, at all times the facility is open for services, trash and or garbage service, a waiting area if waiting or first come, first served services are provided. So, you know, if you're not providing that, then you don't have to worry about a waiting area. Landscaping or buffering or other standards required by the underlying zoning district and associated standards. So we already have a lot of standards for development in those underlying zoning districts. So we didn't want to repeat those here and be redundant. And we can come back if you have questions about that with more information about each zoning district, but that's normally where landscaping, buffering, fences, things like that are required. And then parking is a big one. And we felt like we might need a separate conversation about that at another meeting. And then other. So then on the other column is all shelters may provide, and this is where the meals and dining, clothing and laundry, daycare, case management services, and other information, showers, and then other. So any thoughts about that? This was us just sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall. So
Yeah, Susanna,
I
I know we don't have a should column.
Oh, yeah.
We have must, may, and we don't have a should. But one of the things that may fall under other, but I know we talked about how important access to transportation is for our houseless. I'm just not sure where to put that. It certainly would be in a should column if we had one, but maybe we can give transportation consideration.
Okay.
That's a good point.
Do you want to do it under, it's probably more of a may, and are we getting away from using should or shall in the code? Yeah, and okay. Do you want to explain that, either Elizabeth or Pauline? I don't know.
Well, I would say, you know, when we're looking at what are, you know, if an application comes in and a reviewer or a planner or the public needs to look at the application and say, does this meet the criteria in the code? Should is not something where you can check the box. Is this a yes or a no? And I think those are the kind of criteria we want to, I mean, we want to encourage, sometimes we want to encourage certain things. And so maybe you give a bonus if it's closer to transportation or something like that. You know, if it's a must be within a half mile or a quarter mile of X type of transportation facility, I think that could be a must standard. May standard for transportation, you know, maybe something else to encourage co-location of some kind of transportation service. But I think should is a tough type of criteria to include when you're looking at what are the requirements.
I would definitely add it to this may list with everything else. I think it's a great point, Hans.
So to the may and not the must.
Well, my
think you'll
personal
limit-
opinion
you'll
is
limit
it's a must, but
locations. You'll limit locations if you say must, but I do agree it should be in may. You know,
But we do in other sections of
lots
the
of
code.
public transportation and there'll be lots of opportunities, but right now it's pretty limited.
I mean,
What we've done in
ultimately,
other parts of the code for transportation is kind of what Elizabeth said, it's like an incentive. So if you're located within certain distance of transportation, maybe you get a reduced parking requirement. And
Yeah,
then we start looking at what zones they're going to be in. Maybe we're, and I'm not saying what zones, I'm just making this up, but let's say we were talking about one of the shelters in our standard residential, but maybe not all of the standard residential, maybe only if it's located within a certain distance of transportation. So move it to the must if it becomes an incentive. Because may is really what we're saying with this may column, which is similar to what we have in the code today, is we just want to make it clear that it's okay to have a daycare facility at the site. You don't have to go through another process. And it's okay to have clothing and laundry facilities, or if you want to provide meals and dining, it's not an additional review process. We're just acknowledging that it's okay if you want to offer it. There's no additional review. The must is you have to provide it in order to comply.
Yeah, I like the bonuses. I think that's,
The
that's
incentives are good. Yeah.
Okay.
is there, for people who have kind of worked with the with these facilities before, how would one handle dogs? I know a lot of houseless people have dogs and them to go to appointments or something. Are there, I don't know, I don't want to say it, kennel options, but something in there that allows for that? Or if there'd be maybe a conflict with the code, if there were kind of almost like day shelter for their dogs.
This is Stacy. When we ran the program, the way we managed this was we treated everyone's dog under the guidelines of the ADA. And so they were considered to be service dogs. So you had to be compliant, make sure your dog was with you at all times on a leash, clean up, and that we did have additional crates on site in case we had a dog that had any behavioral issues and didn't get along well with other dogs. Because not allowing dogs is a huge barrier for our unhoused community members to access services. And then we did work with folks on getting the criteria if needed, but it can be expensive. And so we didn't want that to be a barrier. So that's how we managed it. And then we did have, like I said, crates, and usually people would trade with other people if they had to go to court or go to a meeting that did not let their dog into the facility.
So one aspect that maybe kennel area is in the may provide. I definitely agree with Stacy. I think you run into ADA issues if there's a suggestion to prohibit dogs as a standard or animals.
No. I was just wondering. I wasn't talking about prohibiting. I was talking about having facilities that would assist with bringing dogs in, such as if you had a section, if it was a larger facility and you had kind of crate or kennel areas, if there would be a conflict with the code, or if that needs to be kind of protected within the code for a transitional.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, a good point, because we probably have prohibitions in some zoning districts for kennel facilities. And I have to apologize if you're hearing hammering. We're getting our roof redone. They're supposed to come tomorrow, and we got a text last night at 9 that they were coming today. So I think they're right over where I am. So sorry about that.
So I would support that it being in the May, because I think one of the examples that we saw included a fenced area for pets, but I like the idea of calling them service animals and kind of controlling it that way. I think that Stacy brought up made a lot of sense. But yes, we don't want to prevent. I mean, a lot of the homeless do seem to have, or houseless seem to have pets, and as a pet owner myself, I would hate to see that be a prohibition.
In the shelters that we were a low barrier, and so we didn't even require ADA compliant, like that animal be ADA certified. We just had contracts that people would sign so they could bring in whatever animals they had with them. But then it would say that they were required to take care of their animals or find someone similar, like what Stacy was saying, to take care of them if they had to go to court or work or treatment or.
Could we also add storage to may provide? And I was thinking that could not only mean belongings, but maybe bikes or, tents, that kind of thing.
This is Brianna. I had a question on the on-site management and the waiting area as far as the must-haves. So on-site management, to me, that it says at all times. So is there a requirement that that's like an office, or is it just that there is management but it could be an individual just located in the, is it really a building element? And then on the waiting area, just understanding what the need is there for it being a must.
So I can speak to this a little bit, Brianna. What was the discussion with the previous, recent development code changes for shelters? So the discussion about management was that there just be a management presence. This isn't a building requirement, it's a standard of operation almost, that to qualify as a transitional shelter. And I think this is a piece that helps us differentiate between an apartment building or a micro unit and a shelter use, is the management piece is there. At all times, the facility is open for services. Says if you are open only overnight, that's when management would be required to be present. If you're open 24 hours, if you have a day shelter component, then 24 hours would be when management is required to be on site. But this particular sentence doesn't require any particular office or building space for that management person.
That all makes sense to me. So I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly.
And then your second question about a waiting area. So this was a tweak of something that was existing in the code already. And this is, I think the intention behind this sentence in the existing code was to not have folks lining up on the site for services. So if you're going to do first come, first serve services, or if you're going to have people waiting for services, then you need to provide a waiting area on site of sufficient size for the people waiting that you expect to have. So that you have a waiting area inside or outside, but on the site, and you're not having people lining up on the sidewalk waiting for services or in the roadway. So I think that was the intention. And if there's tweaks or changes you all want to make, that's the intention behind those two provisions right now.
Can I ask a question about the definition of open for services? So again, I'll just be selfish and think about what we experienced it with Veterans Villages. We're not open for first come, first serve or any kind of walk-ins. We have 15 residents that go through a screening process and then ultimately will be living there full-time and under full-time case management. But full-time case management means maybe 40 hours a week or maybe 7 days a week part-time. So are we ever open for services? Or are we always open for services? Service will be providing during the day, but then the houseless folks that are going through transitional case management, will be not case management maybe after 5 o'clock and until maybe 8 in the morning the next day. Does this requirement require someone be there sleeping, on site, the entire time 24/7 in those circumstances?
So Eric, in what you've just described, I would interpret the way this is written is that your facility would be open for services. You'd be having people on your site 24 hours. So a management or a person in charge would be required to be identified at all times. The way this is written now. So if that's something that the committee wants to discuss, I think this is one of those standards to find out what works.
Yeah, I'll just submit a vote down on that. So not requiring full-time on-site management or a vote down on the definition of open for services, either one, because together they become, inclusive and restrictive.
I like the idea of having on-site management available or somebody that's ultimately responsible for how the facility or the property operates, but not having somebody physically there at all times, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it sounded like Elizabeth said someone basically could be on call. So if there's an issue, that person could be called. So if it could be clear that somebody responsible is available, but not necessarily on site, I would be supportive of that.
I think that would require adding on-site or on-call management at all times. I think with the inclusion of the word just having on-site would mean there's somebody who is identified as the management in charge on-site at all times. And if that's not needed, then on-call could be added.
Okay, so then just some more elaboration on the definition of management. Sorry, I'm a former engineer, so I just like to have some level of precision. So management is that in the case of Clackamas Veterans Village, they have a village council, and it's 5 elected villagers, so the houseless villagers going through transition, and they have a council leader or a council chair. Is that on-site management?
Oops, went the wrong way. Yes. So I think we could call it management. We could call it person in charge to get kind of at that concept, if that's a concept that the group is supportive of.
Yeah, just again, to be specific, because real world examples help us understand things. So certain neighborhoods may be against, on-site management being a houseless person, right? Even if they're elected. So is it part of the nonprofit service provider? Is it, some kind of paid staff? What is the definition of person in charge? What are, not that I'm looking for resume requirements, but in terms of our neighbors, we want to understand, okay, this person has authority. Who is vesting the authority in this individual, by what means? And is that satisfactory to our neighbors?
And if someone came to me with a code interpretation question of what does management mean, I would say who's been identified by the operator or the owner of the site as the person in charge.
Works for me.
Okay, so we can add a definition of what management implies. And then how does this look on-site or on-call management at all times the facility is open for services? What do folks think about that? Look okay?
Susanna?
Yeah.
This might be a spot where it would be helpful to look at our short-term rental code, because with short-term rentals, there's some sort of a requirement for contact information. We don't refer to it as management, I don't think, in the short-term rental, but I think it's that same idea of what we're looking for here is there's somebody to call who's not the police, right? Obviously, some level of problem, it's just straight go to the police. But I think it is reassuring for neighbors to know there's some phone number, there's some entity, there's something guiding this whole project. And that's where you can put, I think of like good neighbor agreement, a violation of a good neighbor agreement. And so, thank you. That's my
Great.
comment.
Okay.
Barb, I was just thinking the same thing, and I was looking, it doesn't look like that resides in the Bend Development Code, but I bet it's in the licensing part. So I'll double check that and I'll send you the information, Susanna.
Okay. Okay, so we'll work on this provision. Yeah, okay. Anyone else have any comments on that, on the management piece?
Just really quickly, I'll add, in our safe car parking model, what we did was we notified neighbors that there would be a 24/7 person on call, and we distributed that number, and then it's posted at the site that, in the event of an emergency, call, and I'm the one who's 24/7. And that seemed to suffice for people and seemed to, it's worked, at least for the time that we've done safe car parking.
Right.
And that is what is required in the safe parking code is posting of who's the contact information for the person in charge. And that did come partially, I think, from the short-term rental requirements.
Okay, great. So we'll work on this and come back with a revision when we come back with the draft code. Is there anything else? I'm avoiding parking, but anything else before we get on to parking? And do folks feel like they need to take a break? I can't see anyone, but just go ahead and take one if you need to. Okay. Okay, parking. So Yeah, there's obviously a bigger discussion going on citywide about parking and parking minimums and requirements and things like that. But we felt like a lot of folks, their cars are their home. And it would be wise to maybe require some parking at these shelter types. So just putting it out there for discussion. Does anyone have input on that? Stop sharing so we can see each other. Okay.
I'd like to hear from the providers what their experience has been.
This
Go
is
ahead,
Stacy, and I'm thinking about the emergency shelter at the sheriff's department. So there were, I'm trying to remember numbers, roughly 40, 45 guests, and there are a number of folks that do have vehicles. And I think it'd be good to get those numbers from Shepherd's House, but for that program with the 40 or 50, it tended to be about 10 to 15 folks that did in fact have vehicles that were there. So I think some parking is going to be important. Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking back. And I'm not familiar with parking codes, so I don't know the existing codes in terms of how many spots. But I do know that there is a percentage of our folks that do have vehicles that would need to park them in a safe space if utilizing the shelter.
I kind of had a similar statement. I ran the Hanson shelter, which was in the Sheriff's Department of Multnomah County. And we luckily had a very large parking lot because we had 200 folks that stayed there. So finding if you have the opportunity for parking, that it being very beneficial for folks who have their cars. Because I also ran a shelter in a second floor of a business building in downtown Portland, and none of us had parking. So then that was an issue for folks who had their cars. So.
Could I ask a question? Is there any concern that it wouldn't just end up being parking? It would end up being, this is a safe place to be, so I'm gonna park my RV here and hang out for a couple of months. I'm just wondering if that's a concern, if that's something that the providers have seen before, because I could see that being then an issue with the neighborhood.
That was written in the guidelines, and when you come in to use shelter facility, that you understood that there would be no sleeping in your vehicle in the parking lot. So that was written in there. And I believe at the sheriff's office, all the vehicles needed to be cleared in the morning because it was only from 6 p.m. to 6 or 7 a.m. So they did have those guidelines, and each, the rule guideline was signed by each of the guests with that kind of understanding.
Yeah,
Was there?
Sorry, to add to that, we had a contract similar, and it was like part of the good neighbor agreement too, such as like, please don't work on your car in the parking lot, and also like the no sleeping and things like that. And so we always knew whose cars were in the parking lot, and that was kind of like the safety sweep of like walking periodically outside and making sure that everyone was okay.
We did have guests sign in if they had a vehicle, and then they did have to give their license plate number. And so that also helped to eliminate that problem. I think parking will also help if we're going to access volunteers from the community to come in to help with food, things like that. I think that really helps that they do have some parking spots available for them.
Could I ask if anyone's ever had remote parking so that it's not adjacent to the facility? And the reason I ask is we have a lot of places in town that were built with parking lots for the maximum Christmas Eve parking situation. Thinking of Kohl's parking lot, for instance. If there was an opportunity to have an agreement so that if there was a shuttle available, that some of these vehicles could be parked off site. Because my thinking is, a lot of times there's going to be cases where it's a perfect site for a shelter, but there's simply not enough parking. And yet we have excess parking all across town. So it'd be great if there could be that flexibility built in there when we do address the need. There's clearly a need for parking, but maybe it's off-site and there could be some sort of arrangement for that. Just want to put that out.
No, it's a great idea. I know in Washington State, there was a program that tried that and it created several different challenges. One, if you imagine everything you own in the world is in that vehicle, the thought of leaving it a distance from you was really overwhelming. We also ran into the problem that all of a sudden at midnight, someone would remember that their insulin or their heart medicine was in their vehicle. And if it wasn't on site, then how do we get back over to that vehicle? And then it was just the cost because they wanted security, because what was happening was there was a lot of theft. Other people knew those cars were over there not being attended to. And so there was a lot of theft. So just things to consider.
So in the code right now, for on-site parking, and Pauline, maybe you can clarify this for me, how the parking within 1,000 feet can be used to meet the parking requirements for a non-residential use. Is that applicable situation?
I know it's in the code. I don't think we ever use it. So I'm
Occasionally downtown. So there is a provision in the code that allows you to meet some of your parking requirements with parking that is within 1,000 feet. So I think that there's an option potentially to get at what you're talking about, although most parking requirements are met with on.
And the idea of providing storage in the shelters, I'm guessing it would never be enough for what people have in their cars to have that fear. I mean, I appreciate, Stacy, what you're saying. That all makes sense. It just seems like there should be an option somehow to do it that way if it made the most sense. I mean, obviously the best is if it could be adjacent, but if there are circumstances where that just isn't going to work and maybe 1,000 feet isn't enough, I don't know. I just wanted to put it out there that there are locations in town where we have tons of parking and nobody parking in it, that there could be some agreement, but yeah, I don't know how practical that would be.
Maybe it's a specialty application that's just parking, maybe not people using a shelter or something like that, that you could apply for those type of oversized parking lots to be used as parking areas at certain areas or times or different things like that, but it would be a separate application to utilize those.
Okay.
I also wanted to just provide clarification on the overnight use of vehicles question. So we did just adopt 2 programs into the municipal code. One allows for overnight sleeping in vehicle, up to 3 vehicles on any religious or commercial, nonprofit or public entity owned site. So conceivably a shelter site would be owned by one of those types of entities and could allow overnight sleeping in vehicles, but that's an operational property owner concern. And there's also the safe parking program, which through application to the city, an owner or a lessee could allow up to 6 vehicles to be used for overnight sleeping. So it would be a separate program, a separate application, but it could be allowed on the same site as a shelter site as the code is currently written. We wanted to disallow that. A shelter site could not take advantage of a safe parking or a temporary overnight camping program. That could be a standard to discuss here.
So create a provision to not make them a safe parking and a transition and a shelter type on one site. Is that what? Yeah.
So I would say right now,
to do
we
that.
adopted,
Yeah.
if you had a temporary shelter use, you could also have a safe parking, which is the overnight car camping provision. You could also have a temporary overnight camping, which is up to 6 vehicles in the parking lot. We wanted to say, if you're operating a shelter, you can't do overnight parking. I think that could be a topic for discussion right now. I think without specifying, they would both be allowed, but it's a separate application process, not through the development code.
Yeah, is that something that the group feels strongly about? And I think Hans had to leave, so I just want to, he's still on the screen, but I think he sent me a note, he had to leave for a medical thing. So let's see, is that something that the group is interested in discussing, whether we should limit the temporary shelter type concept, and then you can't have a safe parking on the same site? It seems somewhat limiting to me. If you look at what Medford's kind of been doing with their evolving urban campground and things like that, they've kind of left it a little more open, but it's certainly something we could talk about if we wanted to make a recommendation.
I don't think you should limit it personally. If you can comply with both uses and both uses, meet all of the requirements and standards, and they happen to be co-located, great. All the better. You have, better access to case management and on-site management and all of the other things, all the good neighbor policies, all that good stuff.
I agree. I think I wouldn't limit it either. I think it has a lot of benefits. And I think the more open we can leave things, I think the better off we'll be.
Okay, I see a lot of head nodding. I don't know if we need a formal vote, but yeah. Okay, so we won't put any type of language around sort of limiting what folks can do as far as safe parking and a shelter on their site.
Maybe we could put some language in there referencing that that type of parking is allowed in accordance with, and then reference the code section, because like in short-term rentals, we're very specific about prohibiting it, and in other sections. So I think it'd be good just to acknowledge, yes, it's allowed in accordance with the, whatever section Elizabeth was referring to.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so we'll bring that back to you. And what about parking? Parking on-site parking. It sounds like a property owner could propose to do the 1,000-foot away co-locating parking type thing if they wanted to. But it sounds like most of the group here wanted to provide some parking on site for folks. That's the best thing for the users.
So what Stacy mentioned, the number of people who had cars versus the number who were staying in her specific instance, it was like a 0.25. So requiring 0.25 parking might meet. I'm just throwing it out there. That's what it sounded like. I mean, maybe it's a 0.5. I think there is a benefit for volunteers to come and have parking. I know I volunteer at Bethlehem Into Cook, and I drive all the way across town to get there, and it's the only way I can get there. So, there does need to be some parking. And generally speaking, I'm one of those people that believes in zero, no parking minimums. But I think in order to get the acceptance from the public about this and being realistic, that we should have at least something like 0.25, just putting it out there for discussion.
And just for clarity too, we have 3 different types of shelters that we're talking about. And I don't know that a mass shelter might require a different type of parking requirement versus a temporary shelter versus the outdoor shelter. So we might want to break down first, what do we think a parking requirement would be for mass shelters, then temporary, then outdoor.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mass might need more. Yeah.
I was going to throw in there before Pauline asked us to break them up, but I was going to say, what about half 0.5 with that, not exemption, but you can take some of that away with location next to transit. So 0.5 is required. It can go down to 0.25 maybe if there's transit available within however far, a few blocks, quarter of a mile, something. Maybe.
That sounds good. I see some nodding heads. We can run the numbers on something like that. I mean, in a big shelter, well, I'll start sharing again, but in the bigger shelters with like 150 beds or something, I mean, that's 75 parking spots. So that's a lot. So, but I mean, that's a maximum. So a person would, an organization would not have to require, that much, I suppose. I think it's a maximum. No, it would be a minimum. So we'd want to kind of mess with that a little bit and see. Yeah, based on our
I think in a mass shelter, 0.25 makes more sense, but I think Pauline is correct in identifying sort of the different types. The 3 different types might require different amounts. What I don't want to see is one parking space for every person who's staying there, because I
Mhm.
think that's completely unrealistic. So, but I also like Barb bringing it back up, that the proximity to transit, and sometimes we use quarter mile. But, I'm not saying anything specific, but I do think it's a good idea to look at the amount per type of shelter. And then also, as Susanna mentioned, keeping in mind, finding a place that has 75 parking spaces might be pretty tough. So anyway.
My 2 cents is that we make it as flexible as possible, but setting some minimum standards so that it's clear to the public that we expect there to be some amount of parking so that the streets aren't going to be backed up. Maybe 0.25 minimum for all 3 types, and then, can go to a larger number depending on each particular use.
That might be a good idea, but we can go back and run some examples and come back to you with some ideas on what that looks like. Okay. Okay, I'm going to share again so we can keep moving. Let's see. Okay, so have we gotten through kind of the must and the may lists? If you think of anything else, just feel free to email me or email the group, and we can go from there. Let's see. And we'll work on making these similar across both columns, but this is a good starting place, I think.
Susanna, would the May column here be a place where an applicant could propose an alternative way of providing parking, that may have supervised offsite parking with, a shuttle bus, or, so that there is some way of accommodating that flexibility as we move forward? I know you're going to come back to us with examples and we can talk about it then, but I'm just thinking that it would be good to let people know that they could come up with an alternative proposal that made sense in their specific case, that could be determined by the Planning Commission or staff or whatever, to give the maximum flexibility going forward. Because hopefully this whole exercise is good for many years into the future, and we can't anticipate everything.
Yeah, good point. Okay. Anything else to add to these 2 columns? Okay, hearing none. Let's see. Okay, so the next thing we wanted to go through with you about, and let's see, it's a bummer Hans isn't here. We can get his input separately, but is looking at where these different types of shelters should be located. So mass shelters and transitional shelters are, structures, buildings. The outdoor shelter definition is the tiny home, village, or more of a managed camp. And so it made sense to look at the different zoning districts for mass shelters and transitional shelters kind of together. So here are the Bend zone districts, and the residential ones are all here. These are lower density, the RL, RS, RM, and RH are higher density, more multifamily. So looking at different cities, Salem and Eugene's, Medford's, we thought maybe an appropriate starting place, and this is just, throwing spaghetti on the wall again, would be 20 beds in any residential district for a public or institutional use. So that would be a government agency, a school, a park. You could go up to 50 beds. And then for transitional shelter, we have a B&B, which is slightly different, but allowed in residential, which is 4 rooms or 8 guests max are permitted. And so That was just a starting place. And again, the transitional shelter is the concept of project turnkey, so individual rooms. Mass shelter is the larger unpartitioned area. So we were thinking that could go in, schools are allowed in our residential zoning districts, churches, so that would be covered under this mass shelter and the 20 beds. So it'd be a smaller facility. Do folks have input on that, Barb?
What are the P and N columns? What's that? Oh, is that in the small print below?
P is permitted and N is not permitted. That's in our development code. When you look at the use tables, it's P, N, or conditional use. And
Got
we
it.
actually would like to get away from doing conditional use.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Susanna, I would like to suggest that we have RL and RS in one column and then RM and RH in another, because I think that there would be an opportunity in RM and RH to go to a larger number than we would ever consider in RL and RS. I don't know if anyone else has a feeling about that.
Yeah, I was gonna think the RH and RM can handle more beds than the RS and RL.
Completely agree.
Okay, is there anyone that doesn't feel like that? We had started kind of with, if you can look at the next one with the commercial districts with our RM and RH in here instead. So we could either add them to a separate column or just put them in. Salem has their higher density residential districts in with their commercial districts also. So either way. Actually, let me just do this. I think it makes it a little cleaner.
I mean, I would be okay with that unless there's some reason not to, but just definitely allowing more in the RM and RH, however it makes the most sense.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with the lower density zoning districts then. So if you could imagine, let's see, like in a school or a church in one of these zones, would 20 beds be appropriate for a mass shelter?
So Susanna, I just want to jump in. The school or a church would be I think the public or institutional.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Number. Okay. So this 20 would be in some non-institutional building.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, thanks. So if school or church would be up to 50 beds. And then if it was a shelter on just a residential zone lot, a mass shelter could be up to 20. How's that sound?
What do the providers think?
Good idea.
It seems a little high for RS to me, but I don't know if, we have a lot of RS zones, so I don't have a good sense of, I would like to hear from the providers.
Well, I think this 20 is up to, so it could be less. I'm just trying to reflect back, and when I've worked on these before, I think the number was right around 15 or 20 for this zoning.
When we looked at our, we've got a few larger shelters in town, Bethlehem Inn, and here I can go down here. Let's say the winter warming shelter. I think it was 56 beds. For some reason, I thought it was 70, but our records show 56. But Shepherd's House is 30. Bethlehem Inn is 148, but they've got a whole bunch of varying rooms. And then if you look at like Cascade Youth and Family and the women's shelter, they're more like 15 beds. So we sort of felt offering up to 20 might be, that would be on the high side, but reasonable. If somebody wanted to do 16 instead of 15 beds, that would be a reasonable place to start.
I like you to give some flexibility. Also, in the consideration that you could have, 12 or 15, I'll just use women, for instance, that may have children. And then that also will allow for our kiddos to also be able to stay there.
I'm also thinking if you would be restricted by other parts of the code. I mean, a lot size and how high, what the building height is going to restrict how many beds you can I mean, unless you're talking like bunk beds everywhere or something like that. I don't know that you're even going to get to that number given those zones.
Yeah, the fire department would have a say on maximum occupancy depending on exiting and so forth.
Mhm.
That's
Right,
what I
these,
was- well.
yeah, these would still have to meet all building codes. So yeah, the size of the site and the structure that could go on it would limit a lot of that as well.
So I
Yeah.
guess
Given-
from a zoning perspective, do you let it be the higher number? I guess that could be the proposition, is that you let that be the higher number, because then you're going to be limited based on lot size and all of the other code that is going to limit that.
Yeah,
So-
exactly. I mean, what's wrong with making it 25 if we think all the other restrictions might limit it beyond, to that number? But if you can meet fire department code and all of the other building codes, what would be wrong with having, a higher number?
Yeah, I was going to say the women's shelter that I did was 12 bedrooms, and it looked like a large single family home. And there could be up to 24, and quite a few of them were children staying with their mothers. So I would be happy to go to 25, knowing that there are other requirements that would take care of safety.
So remember, this is a mass shelter we're talking about right now. I think what you just started to describe, Kathy, sounds more like a transitional shelter of individual bedrooms. So the mass shelters, picture one room with cots potentially.
Gotcha.
Transitional
Gotcha.
shelter would be multiple sleeping rooms. So I think we want to just make sure we're talking apples and apples. And I think one of the ways we could draft this, Susanna, would be, this is the maximum number unless fewer are allowed per building or fire code or something like that.
Yeah.
I think we're spending a lot of time, and what are we actually liable to find in RL or RS that isn't a church or a school that has a great big room where people can be sleeping? And then, having said that, I'm afraid that a higher number might upset those residents more, even though the chances that it's actually going to happen in their neighborhood is very slim. Again, unless it's public or institutional, which we think could be up to 50. Do you know what I mean?
I completely understand what my gut wants these everywhere, but in a realistic sense, I wonder if you just don't have mass shelter. I mean, because the other piece is what lots are going to be accessible in this capacity and be usable for people if they're located in these zones. And it may be a sort of a balancing act between having higher usage in the other zones and having sort of these other types of transitional, maybe not mass shelter, but having transitional and institutional ones in this zone.
If I may interject, this is Lynn. Wanted to let folks know Saving Grace is in standard residential zone, I believe. I'm double checking that right now. They currently have 24 beds. Plus a little bit of overflow. So I don't know if it makes sense to go up to 25 just to accommodate their existing structure, or if we want to try to create a pathway for them to remain compliant if they need to make updates
But Saving
in the
Grace,
future.
sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't mean to cut you off. But Saving Grace is not a mass shelter, correct? Saving Grace is
That is true. They are sort of in the, and I'm already forgetting our little categories. They do have sort of different rooms, I'll say, but bunks throughout those different rooms. And so I think what made me think of it is Stacy's comment on, women's shelter, let's say, where there are children involved. And so just wanting to make sure that that was known.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think that would still be it, because these are where we're going back and forth is more on the mass shelter. So I wonder if that goes back to maybe the mass shelter isn't the right fit for this zone, but the other ones that are on the table all are and make sense.
Would
I
it
was
make
just
sense to
looking at-
maybe hence, go ahead, Pauline.
Oh, okay, and maybe you talked about it because I've been looking online, but it looks like Portland updated their code maybe in April of this year. And so, and their very low zone, like RL is 20. And then I would say comparable would maybe be RS would be 20, but as you start getting into the higher densities, they range between 30 and 60. And that's for the number of beds in a mass shelter.
This might be one of those, there might be some opportunity here for bonuses for proximity to transportation or even amenities offered. You know, I when I think of mass shelter, there's something that might be downtown, huge room, people, lots of traffic, and then there might be something that's kind of tucked away in a residential neighborhood that's a smaller scale. I don't know. It's kind of hard. I guess I don't have a lot of experience with these. So, is there a big need for mass shelters in RS zones? I just kind of wonder if that's something that's common, and if it is, it seems like it might be located next to public transportation or something like that. Anyways, I was just, in terms of the number of people, that could be adjusted based on other incentives or bonuses.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the likelihood of a mass shelter is probably not like huge in an RL or RS zone, but you know, it would be a bummer to restrict a property owner that might have that ability. I'm wondering, you know, Dawn's house, I'm thinking about the safe parking site over on Dean Swift. I mean, I think that's RS, and I mean, there's only 6 RVs, well, Stacy, you would know actually, 5 RVs, but I think they want to expand it and they can't. But I mean, that's a property owner who wanted to do something, you know, benevolent to the folks, and it would be, but that's an outdoor shelter site according to our definitions. But if we have somebody that would want to do something like that, it would be a bummer if we restricted it, I guess, in these zoning districts. But it might be a good idea to keep them smaller.
Well, I think Barb made a good comment. I mean, you could say 100 number of beds. It'll never happen. You have that number, it might kind of
Inflame.
out and then cause so much pushback that you end up shooting yourself in the foot. I don't think 2025, I don't think that's shooting yourself in the foot, but I just think it's something to kind of be cautious of.
Well, another point I'll bring up, which I know we don't have time to go through, is the word mass shelter for the optics for the public is, it's just a terrible word because I think it just conjures up these images, but I don't know if we have an option to have some other language around that, but just something to be mindful of.
I think that'd be good.
Maybe group shelter, something a little bit nicer. I agree with you.
High density.
High volume, perhaps. Because I do think to Scott's point, we need to choose our words kind of carefully because, and I apologize, I had to take a time out for a while, so I apologize if this doesn't fit, but I know and we know that the public is they're going to extrapolate to the worst case. So they're going to pick the worst words and the worst numbers, and they're going to say, well, that means that you could put in 1,000 beds next door to my home. I mean, they're going to go there. And I think the connotation of some of the words and some of the numbers need to be thought through a little bit, because it's one thing to say we can't imagine 100-bed facility in a certain RS zone, but if we allow it, people are going to assume that that's where we're going. So we just need to be thoughtful, I think. Otherwise, we're going to struggle trying to get the community support.
I completely agree, Hans.
As do I, as Barb and I know, because we get the emails.
Yeah.
That is exactly what happens.
Yeah. So honestly, I would say go ahead and knock that one back down to 20.
Would it make any sense to say 20 adults plus their children and not limit the number of children? Because
I like
I
that.
think
Yeah, I like that.
that's a little more flexible.
Yeah, I like that.
I think,
just-
Kathy, we can look into some fair housing language and see if there's some kind of concept that can accommodate that concept, maybe unaccompanied versus accompanied minors. We'll have to look at it. We want to
Okay,
running into any family definition issues.
gotcha.
We can look at what language might accommodate that idea.
Okay, so we'll follow up with that, but I think we get it. We should probably keep it a little on the smaller side. Just knowing that there's this allowance for the larger when associated with the park, school, church type of thing. And then we will look at, well, should we let's go to transitional shelter then. So again, this is the type with the individual rooms. It sounds like we've got one, the safe haven one, that's bigger than this. And so knowing that, Lynn, we should probably not make that non-conforming. So what do folks think about that? We could go up to 20, maybe the same language that's in here for the transitional one, that it could be 15 adults and their unaccompanied minors or something like that.
So this is, I guess, where I was talking about the 2,400 square foot building I did with 12 bedrooms. And so you could have 24 women or a combination of women and their children. So I think it could stand to be a little bit larger than under group shelters, but that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'm actually, I was kind of wondering when I was looking at it initially how the group shelter beds allocated towards it than the transitional shelter, because I think when you're talking about public perception and something coming in being allowed in your neighborhood, having a home with separate rooms, it just seems keeping with the fabric of the neighborhood than a big open area with a bunch of cots. So I feel could be higher, and I again, I don't lease or anything, but it just from kind of an outside perspective, it seems like this is more palpable to the public.
Can I just, Susanna, just really quickly? So I have one concern about the unaccompanied minors. I think the 25 adults and their children, an unaccompanied minor falls under a whole other legal that we usually go to Cascade Youth and Family or J by J. And so we don't want it to appear that we'll have under 18-year-olds, like 13, 15-year-olds that would be sheltered there. Because then you run into a whole different thing with other adults and background checks. So I think we just want to take unaccompanied out.
Okay.
And then make sure we're referring to the proper agencies for that population. There is something written in the law that you can provide shelter for, like, I think it's up to 24 hours while you're finding a safe place. So you're not just releasing an unaccompanied minor onto the street. But
I think Lynn has her hand up. I'm not sure if she has something to add on this pointer that's left over.
Oh, sorry, that's left over from talking about Saving Grace a while back. Sorry.
I do have a comment on when we're talking about transitional shelter. I know we're talking about people, but the title is maximum number of rooms. From a planning perspective, we can easily look at a site plan or a floor plan and review the number of rooms by standard. We don't review number of people. So I guess we could, like when Kathy was talking about hers, I mean, it's not like you had 12 rooms. Didn't matter how many people are in there, it was just a number of rooms.
Yeah, to be honest, if there was a surge, they had bunk beds. They could actually put 4 people in a room, but typically they did 2. So yeah, that's a good point, Pauline.
But if you have rooms that have bunk beds in them, wouldn't a group shelter? I think the language in the initial transitional shelter was for individual, for living rooms for people who are houseless. I guess maybe Eric, you've got the engineering mindset. What you know, I just kind of wonder about how those definitions, the fuzziness of them, and how they kind of interact. Because how could you could kind of see it as both a group shelter or a transitional shelter, right? If you don't have language about the occupants within the shelter, within the rooms, or the beds within the rooms.
I'm wondering, does it help if we consider the existing shelters that we're aware of and the numbers of rooms they have and the definitions that work? You know, if we think about a Bethlehem or a Shepherd's Inn or what have you, certainly we need to be careful not to put a number here that all of a sudden they don't comply with this number that we're talking about. So we do need to be cognizant of existing shelters and existing beds and any language that speaks to that. Maybe that gives us some guidance, because we certainly don't want to suddenly have these existing shelters that meet our needs all of a sudden be outliers based on any recommendations we made. So I think there is an overlay there that we need to just keep in mind.
Yeah, to speak about the earlier point, you know, I noticed in Portland's documentation, they call it, you know, shelter to housing continuum. And the word continuum, you know, speaks to, you know, my definitional view of everything. Like, okay, is it a transitional shelter or is it a group shelter? Well, you know, I would be careful to overly define things because it becomes restrictive. It's a continuum, you know, the shelter is there and it might occupy, you know, both places, you know, on the continuum, where most of the time it might be a transitional shelter, but then they throw a couple of bunk beds together and maybe it is a group place, but I wouldn't want to limit the ability to occupy as a, if it was permitted as a transitional shelter, and all of a sudden, you know, there's a family in one room. So, you know, the city approved a 12 room dwelling, not counting the bodies. And all of a sudden one room has 3 people in it and all the other rooms have 2, and you're over this limit, or maybe 4 people, you know, something that takes it over the limit, where the room is designed to handle that. And the bunk beds might be 2 kids, right? Which doesn't make it a group shelter. So to go back to the earlier point, it's a continuum of shelter solutions that we're trying to resolve. And I think if you have asterisks in your definitions, you know, 25 adults and their children, or how many bedrooms, you know, so that it's not as tightly defined by body count, then I think you solve the problem.
Pauline, do we have, other than lot coverage restrictions on RS or RL, are there building size limits in RS or RL?
No, there's not. Just a height, you know, and setbacks and parking. All the development standards will pretty much dictate how big the building's going to be.
And then for the architects, are there size restrictions for a bedroom size within? So we have development code that would restrict the size of a building on any particular lot in RS or RL. I'm just wondering what other standards we have that may actually physically constrain the size and the number of bedrooms in these particular zones.
Kathy, wasn't there with the micro units a measurement of 7 feet in any direction?
There's a minimum. That's building code though. Yeah. Right. I think is, yeah, you can't have tiny little occupiable rooms.
Yeah, there's also a definition of bedroom includes a closet, and I didn't provide closets in ours. We had storage closets instead. So it's kind of like a different animal than you would consider a single family home. But I agree with what Eric was talking about. Perhaps under where you have 25 adults, it really should say 12 bedrooms or something like that, because we don't know how they're going to be occupied, and it gives us some more flexibility.
Let's keep in mind too that residential single very quickly will mean up to a quad, and a quadplex with 2 or 3 bedrooms per is not a single home on a lot. So I don't know, Pauline would know better than I suppose, to what extent 2001 is going to affect this. But when we think of residential single, we certainly not restrict our thinking to a single home on a piece of property, because 4 with 3 bedrooms would be 12 rooms on that RS lot.
So I think what we would say here is we're looking at the number of rooms on a site. And if it happens to be, let's say, a triplex, that is one structure on a site, we would look at that triplex. And if we're saying a maximum of 12 rooms on the site, that entire triplex can only have 12 rooms, but they can each have their own kitchen, and maybe they each have, doing the math, 4 rooms each, and each, you know, triplex unit, you just still have a transitional shelter. It's just a triplex.
Kathy,
Yeah.
what zone was your 12-bedroom unit in?
It was a residential zone, but it was a county property, sorry. Yeah, but it was residential, standard residential.
So why don't we start with the 12 rooms, and we'll do some research on what Portland's allowing, different cities, and how to finesse the language based on fair housing language, and make sure we're saying things appropriately. And I also want to go back and make sure we're not going to make anything we've got going right now a non-conforming use. So we'll come back with that, but I think this is all really good input and things to think about. I just want to do a time check. We're at 10:42. Why don't we go for another 5 minutes, and then we'll go for public comment, and we'll pick this up next time we meet in June, but we'll come back with drafts and things like that. Why don't we go ahead and talk about the RM and RH? Oops, I'm sorry about that. I do think it makes sense to break up these two kind of sets of zoning districts a little bit differently. So as far as the group shelter, and I'm just going to start calling it group until we think of a different name. I like getting away from mass as well. So yeah. So anyone have some ideas? Different places, I could pull up Salem's. I think they had something like 75 to 100 to cover their commercial and then their higher density residential zoning districts. Does anyone have thoughts on that? Our winter warming shelter was 56 beds. Shepherd's House is 30. So just to give you some context. Anyone have input?
I'll just say that I think 100 is probably fine. You know, that gives you the flexibility. I mean, I don't think that the neighborhood groups are going to be so concerned about RM and RH than they are about RL and RS. So if we err on the high end, I mean, all the other restrictions about siting that we have in those districts are going to kick in. There may be a significantly large lot that can accommodate that many. You don't want to preclude it. That would be my thought.
Yeah, anyone else have any input on that?
The one thing that I've been thinking through this whole discussion was when the cold shelter was at First Pres, I went over to see how that was happening. And if I'm not mistaken, they could accommodate 40, maybe in the 40s of people. And that's a pretty big church, and there were people in the hall and people in the sanctuary. And so as far as, again, what we might actually find, well, that's also a public or institutional use. So I'm just, you know, kind of using that for scale in my own mind of just what would it take to accommodate more than about 50. And that's starting to get to be a pretty big facility, I think. And just, again, are we setting ourselves up for battles that we just don't need to fight, because it's just not going to happen in that zone. But either way, that's kind of what I've been having as my just something for scale in my brain, you know.
I worked that first Presbyterian shelter, and the reason why the numbers were small, which actually the numbers kept getting approved to go larger from the fire department, is because of COVID restrictions. So maybe there's some number based on COVID. Maybe we could look at COVID best practices. I'm not really sure. But yeah, so I think that numbers could be higher based on non-pandemic numbers and maybe lower based on safety or around pandemic things.
Okay.
I was just going to echo that. And I know we set up tents because we purchased tents to go inside of the First Press hall for COVID purposes. And it actually was kind of a nice privacy barrier.
It was nice.
It worked out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. I'd kind of forgotten about that COVID thing. But those tents, I'm serious, I thought that was a really nice solution to give people that little bit of privacy, even if it weren't COVID.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna put this at 100 unless I hear otherwise. Can't see anyone, so I'm gonna think that that's okay. Okay. And then for transitional shelter, so the room divided building in the higher density zoning districts. Any
I'm
ideas?
going to go out on a limb and say unlimited. That there are other restrictions, and just say unlimited and it'll be what it'll be. I see Eric had his thumb up on now.
Anyone else have any input? Okay.
You'll go with unlimited. I might suggest language, something that says in conformance with the underlying zoning requirements, just so it isn't, there are actually limits. They're just not listed here.
I agree.
Yeah, so it would be like a humongous hotel going in, a similar type thing. So if we say the underlying zoning district, that will restrict, that will send us to that. Okay. Okay, it's 10:48. Maybe I could get a sense of how many of the folks that are waiting in the lobby, you could raise your hands. There's 4 people waiting for public comment, are gonna want to provide public comment. Looks like 3. So yeah, why don't we go for another 2 minutes, the sounding board, and then we'll shift over to public comment. Okay. So for the, let's see, the CB, the CCPO and mixed use riverfront, I think, Pauline, correct me if I'm wrong. We're thinking again, it could probably be pretty similar to what's in the higher designated residential. So 100 for the group shelter. And then I had started at 80, but we could do the same thing, unlimited in conformance with the underlying zoning district for those, if the group wanted to do something like that. Any ideas on that?
I'm just gonna, yeah, I just want to offer up, I do think that for a lot of people in the community, unlimited is going to be a word that's worrisome to a lot of people, and it forces us to say, well, yeah, it's not unlimited, it's subject to conform, and then we're explaining ourselves and we're on our heels being defensive. I just think that that word unlimited scares people, that for what it's worth.
Yeah, we could just say in conformance with the underlying zoning district.
I'd be fine with that.
Put the word limited in there and you'll have the same thing, limited by underlying zoning district.
Yeah, I think limited, frankly, is a word that's comforting to some.
Exactly.
And it doesn't really restrict our opportunities.
I think that sounds good. Okay, we can work with these all with the same type of thing. We had the mixed use, we can come back to this next time. I think we're running out of time. Actually, the mixed use zoning district, because I think it's probably a bigger discussion.
I just wanted to bring something up real quick because as different zoning districts, and the one thing zoning district that stands out to me is the convenience commercial, and there's only a handful of these areas that are zoned convenience commercial, and they seem very hand-picked in specific spots and neighborhoods to try and trigger like a more of a or adding some sort of commercial or something within a neighborhood that might need it. And I just wonder about I wonder about taking convenience commercial out of this, just because I live in an area, and I talk about this way too much. I live in Southeast, and there's I can walk to or anything, and there's these, there's just a handful of little areas throughout Bend that are set aside for a convenience commercial, and if those end up getting taken up with a transitional shelter as opposed to something that the communities, some of these areas are in dire need of, I feel kind of bad about that. Again, this is not restricting, it wouldn't be restricting these shelters, and I don't know the total acreage, but it's fairly minimal. And a lot of these convenience commercial sites are they're like one property kind of thing on a corner. I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm all about complete neighborhoods and things like that, and I don't want to feel exclusionary or anything, but I just and that's just for the convenience commercial.
Scott, for clarity, are you talking about the very few neighborhood commercial sites that we have, like Jackson's Corner, or are you talking about like the strip on Galveston commercial?
CC is actually, it's like Galveston, and I think 3rd Street is, some of 3rd Street is CC also.
Maybe
in the interest of time, we provide you all with the definitions or the descriptions of the different commercial zones and a map for the next discussion, and we can get into that's, since we're going to be discussing the mixed use next time, we can provide information and context for this discussion.
That sounds good. And the other thing is, I didn't have a chance to do this before this meeting, but as far as industrial zones, one thing Pauline brought up in kind of researching all of this is if we have heavy industrial businesses that are established and they're using things like chemicals or flammable materials, we wouldn't want to probably allow a residential type use, like for a group shelter or anything like that right next to them, just because of fire and life safety building codes. So we'll research that a little bit more, to negatively affect the business and have them have, potentially need to revise their business practices and stuff. So we just want to be cognizant of the existing industrial users out there, and, just for safety of the residents as well. So we'll come back with more information on that with you next time. So let me go ahead and stop sharing. I can. Okay. Hi. Okay. So let's go ahead. Anything else on that before we move to public comment? Okay, next time we'll pick up where we left off, and we'll be working on some drafts in the background, and come back to you with that stuff for the next meeting. So let's see. So I'm just going to go down the list. Eric Garrity, I'm going to allow you to talk. Go ahead. About 2 minutes, 3 minutes. So
I'll take less than that. No, I just wanted to say I was listening to almost all of the discussion today, and everyone was doing a really, really good job. I thought I was happy that there was considerations made about the pets of some of the campers and some of the language choices that were used. And I just wanted to voice support for, I think at the end there was the language that was limited by underlying zoning. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks.
Thank you. Let's see. There you are. Okay. Mike Satcher, allow you to talk.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I've been listening all morning and wanted to say I really appreciate the work you're all doing. I'd like to take this time to follow up with you all on something I've brought up at the last two meetings. I want to talk about trash collection again. And before I go on, I want to acknowledge that I realize that isn't exactly the focus of this board. I understand that you're focused on things like zoning for housing types, et cetera. But I'd urge you to consider the fact that many of your plans for housing types, particularly the outdoor shelter type, are going to involve the accumulation of trash. And I saw that you included language that all shelter types must provide trash collection services. And so I just think there's a real opportunity there for the city to save a lot of money while also helping people in need, because right now in Bend, volunteer mutual aid groups are providing trash collection services for our houseless neighbors in the camps. We're 100% volunteer driven, but right now the work is happening out of our own pockets. Through his nonprofit, John Riggs was able to buy a garbage truck, as I'm sure you know, but it isn't free to run the truck. It is worth noting that every time we arrive with the truck at a camp, the residents themselves sort of pass the hat to collect what they can so we can put gas in the truck, in the tank. It's just nowhere near enough. So this trash collection service, it not only beautifies the city, it can also help make our streets safer and more sanitary. And, I listened to the budget meeting last night. It just doesn't seem that helping us with these costs is on anybody's radar right now. We've got the truck, we've got the bodies for the labor. All we're asking is the city pitch in to help with the operating costs. And in the long term, it's going to save the city money because we can provide the truck itself and the bodies. So I just think it fits in very nicely with a lot of what you're already planning to do. And I'd just like it to be on everybody's radar. Look at that, 2 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Chuck Hemingway, I'm going to allow you to talk. Hi, Chuck.
Hello, hi. Chuck Hemingway. I'm with Square One and Ben Church, the Managed Village Initiative that would actually come under the outdoor shelter provisions. Just want to say thanks for all the great work that you're doing. It's really impressive. And I really appreciate the change from the name of mass shelter to group shelter. I think that's great. Under the all shelters provision, the one comment I would have is it says all shelters must provide restrooms. For me, that implies a flush toilet and a sink and that sort of thing. But for an outdoor shelter, that might not be what would be the appropriate term. And my suggestion would be to take a look at the recreation parks and organizational camps provisions at page 8. Which defines it as toilets, and maybe toilets expand that definition of restrooms to include toilets, sanitation facilities, that sort of thing. I know you weren't talking about outdoor shelters today, but since this term was it said all shelters must provide bathrooms, I thought that might be something to bring up at this point. Thank you. And again, I really appreciate all the work you're doing.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll look at that because some facilities could just provide porta potties, and that's kind of what we require on the safe parking program. So I think that's a good point. Okay. Anything else for the good of the order? So the great work. I think we made a lot of progress. Megan, anything to close?
No, I agree. I feel like we really got somewhere today, and I really appreciate all of the conversation and the sensitivity in doing what we're doing, trying to house our neighbors. So thank you everyone for today.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Stuff to go out hopefully soon for the next meeting. So yeah, All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.